The sun was high overhead when Adam Whitman set off on his solo hike into the woods north of Ellensburg, Washington. It was a perfect day for a hike, clear skies, the soft sound of wind rustling through the evergreens, and the crisp smell of pine needles underfoot. Adam had been working long hours at his tech job in Seattle, and this weekend was his chance to escape the grind and recharge in nature. He'd been here before, hiking these trails, but never so deep into the woods. This time, he wanted something more remote, a challenge to test his endurance and focus. The trail was narrow, winding through the dense forest that stretched endlessly in every direction. As he hiked, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the whispers of the wind and the occasional snap of a branch beneath his boots. His backpack was heavy, but he felt strong, energized by the isolation. Adam relished being alone out here, far from the noise of the city, with only his thoughts and the quiet of the wilderness for company. After a few hours of hiking, the trail began to fade, and Adam found himself walking off the beaten path. The terrain grew more rugged, with thick underbrush and uneven ground. He glanced at his map but wasn't concerned. He liked the idea of getting lost, of exploring the wilderness on his own terms. He could always find his way back. As the afternoon wore on, Adam decided to take a break. He found a small clearing beneath a towering pine tree and sat down, taking a swig of water from his bottle. The silence here was deeper, almost unsettling, as if the forest itself were watching him. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the peace of the moment wash over him. When he opened his eyes again, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Adam stood, stretched, and slung his backpack over his shoulder. He had a few more hours of daylight left, enough time to explore a bit further before heading back to his car. That's when he felt it. The ground beneath him gave way. There was no warning, no time to react. 1 second, Adam was walking, and the next, the earth opened up beneath his feet. He gasped, his arms flailing as he plunged downward. The fall was quick but disorienting, his body tumbling through the air before slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, he lay still, gasping for breath. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He tried to sit up but winced as pain shot through his right leg. It wasn't broken, but it hurt like hell. He felt a surge of panic rise in his chest as he looked around, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He was in a hole. A deep, narrow pit, about 15 feet below the surface. The walls were steep and slick, lined with roots and jagged rocks. Dirt and debris trickled down from above as the edges of the hole crumbled slightly from his fall. Adam stood slowly, wincing as he tested his weight on his injured leg. The pain was manageable, but the reality of his situation hit him hard. He was trapped. Looking up, he could see the sky through the small opening above, but the hole was too deep for him to climb out. He tried jumping, clawing at the walls, but they were too high, too slippery. His fingers scraped against the dirt and rock, but he couldn't get a solid grip. His heart raced as the weight of his situation sank in. He was stuck down here, in the middle of nowhere, with no one around to help him. But then something else hit him, a foul, putrid stench that filled his nostrils and made him gag. It was overwhelming, like the smell of rotting flesh and decay. He recoiled, covering his nose and mouth with his sleeve, his stomach churning from the odor. What was this place? He crouched low, scanning the walls and floor of the pit. The ground was soft and spongy, coated with a thick, slimy layer of filth. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that the floor wasn't just dirt. It was something else, something wet, dark, and foul. His stomach lurched as he realized what it was. Human waste. This wasn't just a pit. It was a dumping ground, a makeshift latrine. The stench, the slimy floor, the dark stains on the walls, it all made sense now. Adam gagged, his body heaving as he tried not to vomit. He staggered backward, away from the worst of it, his mind reeling. How had he fallen into something like this? Who would dig a hole like this, so far from any trails or campsites? Was it abandoned? Or worse, was it still being used? Panic gripped him again, stronger this time. He had to get out. He couldn't stay here, surrounded by the filth, the smell, the horror of what he'd fallen into. He turned to the walls again, frantically searching for any handhold, any way to climb out. His fingers dug into the dirt, his boots scraping against the walls, but it was no use. The walls crumbled beneath his touch, and the mud-coated surface offered no grip. His breathing grew ragged, his chest tightening as fear clawed at his mind. He shouted, his voice echoing up out of the pit, but the dense forest swallowed the sound. No one was around to hear him. No one even knew where he was. His phone had no signal out here, and he hadn't told anyone exactly where he was going. For a moment, Adam allowed himself to sit in the silence, trying to collect his thoughts. He needed to stay calm, to think clearly. There had to be a way out. He couldn't just stay down here, waiting for someone to find him. If anyone was even out here to begin with. The hours dragged on as the light overhead began to fade. The shadows in the pit grew longer, the air cooler. The smell was unbearable, the foul stench hanging heavy around him, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. Every breath he took felt like poison, the filth beneath him sinking into his skin, coating his clothes. He felt something crawl over his hand, a bug, a beetle maybe, and he jerked away, slapping it off. But then there were more. He could hear them now, skittering through the waste, crawling up the walls, drawn to the foulness of the pit. He swatted at them, panic rising again as he realized he wasn't alone down here. The pit was alive with insects, their tiny legs scratching at his skin. He shouted again, his voice hoarse and desperate, but no one answered. Night fell, and with it came the cold. Adam wrapped his arms around himself, trying to keep warm, but the dampness of the pit clung to him, seeping into his bones. The bugs swarmed, crawling over his legs, his arms, his face. He tried to brush them off, but there were too many. His mind raced, panic blurring his thoughts. He couldn't stay down here. He couldn't. But there was no escape. The hours crawled by, each minute an eternity as the cold and the bugs and the stench pressed in on him. He felt his mind slipping, his thoughts scattering like the insects in the filth around him. His body ached, his leg throbbed, but worse than the physical pain was the hopelessness that weighed on him. He was trapped, forgotten, lost in the depths of the earth. He thought of his family, his friends, the people he'd see again once he made it back to the city. But with each passing hour, those thoughts faded, replaced by the harsh reality of his situation. The pit was his world now, dark, cold, and crawling with life. A world that smelled of death and decay. As dawn broke, the faint light filtering down into the pit, Adam knew one thing with a cold certainty: if he didn't find a way out soon, this pit would become his grave. He stood again, his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. His fingers dug into the dirt walls, desperate, determined. He had to try again. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let this place consume him. But as his fingers slipped on the slimy surface, as the dirt crumbled beneath his hands, he realized the truth. There was no escape. Not from this. And as the sun rose above the trees, casting light down into the pit, Adam finally understood the depth of his despair. He was alone, trapped in a hole that no one would ever find, surrounded by the waste of humanity, with nothing but the crawling insects and the cold earth to keep him company. The forest, so peaceful and beautiful before, had swallowed him whole. And no one would ever know.